There was, as Miss Marple often remarked, very little in human nature that could not be observed at a village fête. The remark had been made only a few days before the Rose Hill Summer Exhibition and Parish Fundraiser, during a conversation with Mrs. Bantry over weak tea and rather excellent seed cake. Mrs. Bantry, who delighted in village occasions provided they were not too warm, too crowded, or too earnest, had declared that fêtes were harmless nonsense. "My dear Jane," she had said, adjusting the ribbons on her garden hat, "there is nothing remotely dangerous about sponge cakes and raffles." Miss Marple had smiled gently. "On the contrary," she said, "one sees jealousy, vanity, greed, resentment, wounded pride, and occasionally theft all within a quarter of an hour beside the jam stall." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You make Rose Hill sound like the Borgias." "My dear," said Miss Marple mildly, "human beings are much the same everywhere." The village of Rose Hill lay some miles from St. Mary Mead, though similar enough in appearance to satisfy the expectations of anyone fond of English postcards. There was a green shaded by chestnut trees, a Norman church with uneven stones silvered by age, 2 shops of uncertain prosperity, and a winding lane bordered with foxgloves and hedges alive with sparrows. It was the sort of village in which everyone knew one another's habits while pretending not to. The summer exhibition had been organized principally by Mrs. Edith Harbury, a large, energetic woman whose belief in committees amounted almost to a religion. The event was intended to raise money for repairs to the church roof, though several villagers privately believed Mrs. Harbury enjoyed authority far more than charity. By 2:30 on the afternoon of the fête, the field behind the vicarage had filled pleasantly with striped tents, white-painted tables, bunting, and villagers dressed in their Sunday best. Children ran in dangerous proximity to crockery. Elderly ladies clustered beneath parasols discussing hydrangeas and insufficient rain. A brass quartet from Much Benham attempted selections from Gilbert and Sullivan with uneven success. Miss Marple sat near the tea-tent with knitting resting in her lap and observed everything. That was her habit. Beside her sat Florence Hill, Rose Hill's postmistress, who possessed the kind of cheerful indiscretion often mistaken for friendliness. "They say Colonel Harbury is furious," Mrs. Hill murmured confidentially, "about the silver thimble." Miss Marple lifted her eyes mildly. "The silver thimble? You haven't heard?" "Oh, my dear Miss Marple, everyone's talking of it." This was not strictly true. Only 6 people were talking of it at present, but in villages 6 people constituted the beginning of destiny. Mrs. Hill leaned closer. "It belonged to Colonel Harbury's grandmother, apparently. Quite valuable. 17th century silver, or perhaps 18th. It disappeared 3 days ago from the display cabinet in Rose Hill Manor. How unfortunate." "Yes, and there's to be a reward. Though personally I always say valuables ought not to be displayed where anyone can see them. Temptation is temptation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The Rose Hill Manor exhibition table stood beneath a striped awning some distance away. Various antiques from local households had been assembled there for charitable display. Miniatures, silver boxes, porcelain shepherdesses, snuff-boxes, and embroidered samplers. Near the cabinet stood Colonel Hugh Harbury himself, tall, grey-haired, military in bearing, and visibly annoyed by life in general. His wife Edith fluttered anxiously nearby. "The whole thing is absurd," the colonel was saying sharply to the vicar. "A thief in Rose Hill? Nonsense." "Quite," said the vicar uncertainly. "And yet the thing has vanished into thin air." Mrs. Harbury noticed Miss Marple looking in their direction and came bustling over. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "such dreadful business. We are all quite upset. How distressing for you." Mrs. Harbury lowered her voice dramatically. "Between ourselves, Colonel Harbury suspects one of the servants." Miss Marple made a small sympathetic sound. "But one never knows," continued Mrs. Harbury eagerly. "There are outsiders everywhere during fêtes, tradespeople, delivery boys, tourists. One hears such stories nowadays." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Harbury seemed less distressed than invigorated. Before she could reply, a commotion arose near the flower competition. A young woman had dropped an entire tray of lemonade glasses. The crash turned heads instantly. Miss Marple noticed several things at once. The young woman, Sally Brent, who assisted at the Bluebell tea-rooms, looked pale and distracted. Her hands trembled badly. More curious still was the expression on the face of Lawrence Red, the solicitor's nephew, who stood nearby pretending not to watch her. Fear, Miss Marple thought. or guilt. Interesting how alike the two could appear. The afternoon proceeded with the agreeable confusion typical of English village festivities. Prizes were awarded for marrows of alarming size. The vicar's wife lost track of raffle tickets. 2 children fought violently over a wooden whistle. Tea was poured continuously, and beneath the harmless surface of it all moved invisible currents. At shortly after 4 o'clock the weather changed. Clouds gathered unexpectedly from the west, darkening the sunlight. The brass quartet faltered midway through 3 little maids from school. A wind stirred the bunting. "Thunder," said Miss Ice. Hill nervously. People began glancing upward. Mrs. Harbury announced that events would continue regardless of weather, but there was already the unmistakable sense of a day turning sour. Then came the scream. It cut sharply across the field. For one suspended instant no one moved. The scream came again. This time everyone ran. The sound had come from the old orchard behind the vicarage grounds, a shaded place seldom visited except during apple season. Villagers hurried through the narrow gate in a confused cluster of alarm and curiosity. Miss Marple rose more slowly. She disliked crowds in moments of excitement. People observed less when agitated. By the time she reached the orchard, a small circle had already formed beneath the trees. Someone was crying. Colonel Harbury stood rigid and pale. On the ground, partly concealed among long grass and fallen blossoms, lay the body of Beatrice Colwyn. For a moment the orchard was utterly silent. Beatrice Colwyn had arrived in Rose Hill only 8 months earlier. A widow of perhaps 45, she had rented Ivy Cottage near the lane and quickly established herself as a woman of refinement and intelligence. She played bridge well, dressed tastefully, and possessed the kind of self-contained charm that interested men and irritated women. Now she lay terribly still beneath the apple trees. A narrow silk scarf had tightened cruelly about her throat. Dr. Haydock, who had been judging the preserves competition, knelt beside the body with professional briskness. After a brief examination he rose slowly. "She's dead," he said quietly. The words spread outward through the villages like cold water. Someone gasped. Mrs. Harbury began weeping immediately and rather loudly. Miss Marple looked carefully around the orchard. People were revealing themselves already. Colonel Harbury looked shocked, genuinely so. Lawrence Red appeared almost sick. Sally Brent stood frozen beside the gate, one hand pressed against her mouth. But it was not those reactions that interested Miss Marple most. It was Mrs. Diana Weatherby. Elegant, composed, and faintly beautiful, despite her age, Mrs. Weatherby stood very still beneath the trees, holding a pair of gloves in one hand. Her expression was not grief. It was relief, only for an instant. Then it vanished. Inspector Gerald Pike from Much Benham arrived within the hour, damp from rain and visibly irritated at being summoned away from a cricket match. The villagers repeated everything they knew and much they did not. Miss Marple listened quietly from a chair in the vicarage drawing-room while tea was distributed in a state of collective hysteria. "There must have been a maniac wandering about," declared Mrs. Finch. "Nonsense," snapped Colonel Harbury. "This is not London." "Did anyone see her leave the fete?" asked Inspector Pike. There was confusion. Some had seen her near the antiques display, others near the flower tent. Mrs. Hill believes she had gone toward the orchard shortly before 4. "Alone?" asked the inspector. A pause followed. Then Sally Brent spoke suddenly. "No." Every head turned toward her. The girl had gone pale again. "I saw someone with her." "Who?" asked Pike sharply. Sally hesitated. Miss Marple noticed the slightest flicker pass across Lawrence Reed's face. Then Sally whispered, "Mr. Reed." An audible murmur swept the room. Lawrence Red stood up abruptly. "That's absurd." "Is it?" said Inspector Pike. The young solicitor flushed angrily. "I spoke to Mrs. Colwyn for perhaps a minute, nothing more." "What about?" "That is none of your business." Unfortunately, Miss Marple reflected, that was precisely the sort of thing guaranteed to become everyone's business immediately. Rain began striking softly against the drawing-room windows. The atmosphere inside grew heavier. Inspector Pike questioned Lawrence Red closely. The answers came reluctantly. Yes, he had known Mrs. Colwyn before she came to Rose Hill. Yes, they had met privately on several occasions. No, he would not explain the nature of their acquaintance. By the time the interview ended, suspicion had settled firmly upon him. The inspector's expression suggested satisfaction. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly atop her knitting. Something was wrong. Not with the evidence, perhaps, at least not yet, but with the feeling of it. and Miss Marple had learned long ago that feelings, properly examined, were often as valuable as facts, especially in villages. By the following morning, the village of Rose Hill had accomplished what villages invariably accomplished after tragedy. It had transformed uncertainty into certainty with astonishing speed. By breakfast time, Lawrence Reed had already murdered Beatrice Colwyn at least 6 different ways, according to 6 different households. At the Bluebell tea-rooms, Mrs. Pritchard declared confidently that the affair was obviously romantic. At the butcher's, Mr. Clegg insisted money must be involved. Mrs. Finch, whose imagination improved greatly whenever facts were scarce, informed anyone willing to listen that Beatrice Colwyn had once been connected with foreign agents. Only Miss Marple refrained from conclusions. She sat that morning beside the window of her guest-room at the Bantrys' cottage in Rose Hill, knitting steadily while rain drifted in pale curtains across the garden. Mrs. Bantry entered carrying coffee. "Well," she announced, "they're all saying the young man did it." Miss Marple accepted the cup politely. "My dear Jane, you sound unconvinced. I rarely trust conclusions reached before luncheon." Mrs. Bantry laughed despite herself and settled opposite. "The inspector seems quite satisfied." "Indeed. But you aren't." Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. "My dear Dolly, people who commit crimes are often untidy emotionally. They leave little traces of themselves everywhere: vanity, fear, impatience, resentment. What struck me yesterday was not merely what young Mr. Red did, but what everyone else did." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "That sounds very cryptic." "It is only observation." Outside, the rain intensified. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the orchard. She remembered the wet grass beneath villagers' shoes, Mrs. Harbury's theatrical sobbing, Colonel Harbury's genuine confusion, Sally Brent trembling violently near the gate, and Mrs. Diana Weatherby. Relief. Just for an instant. Miss Marple had seen it plainly. Not relief at death exactly, people were rarely so simple, but relief at something ended. Fear ended, perhaps, or danger. There came a knock at the door before Miss Marple could pursue the thought further. It was Florence Hill, the postmistress, damp from the weather and visibly excited. "My dear Miss Marple, such dreadful developments." Mrs. Bantry murmured faintly, "There always are." Mrs. Hill lowered herself eagerly into a chair. "They've searched Mr. Reed's rooms." "Oh?" said Miss Marple. "And Inspector Pike discovered letters." "What sort of letters?" "From Mrs. Colwyn." Mrs. Hill's voice dropped dramatically. "Personal letters." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "There usually are personal letters in these cases." Mrs. Hill ignored the remark. "They quarrelled, apparently." "Violently." "Did they?" said Miss Marple. "The inspector says witnesses heard raised voices last week near the lane behind the church." "How unfortunate." Mrs. Hill leaned closer. "And there's more." "There always was. The missing silver thimble has not been found." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "No?" "And Colonel Harbury now believes Mrs. Colwyn may have taken it." That interested Miss Marple. Not because she believed it, she did not, but because accusations in villages were seldom random. They emerged from prior feelings, old grievances, buried resentments. "Did Colonel Harbury know Mrs. Colwyn well?" she asked. Mrs. Hill's eyes brightened instantly. "Oh, there were certainly stories." Mrs. Bantry groaned softly. "My dear Florence, there are stories about anyone who owns a decent hat." But Mrs. Hill pressed on happily. "They spent a great deal of time together. Bridge parties, discussions about antiques." "And Mrs. Harbury?" asked Miss Marple. "She disliked Mrs. Colwyn." There it was. Simple, immediate, human. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. After Mrs. Hill departed, carrying fresh gossip toward the post-office like a bee carrying pollen, Mrs. Bantry gave Miss Marple a curious glance. "You're thinking." "You've noticed something?" "Several things. But—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must not arrange facts too quickly. Human beings are so disappointingly inconsistent." At 11 o'clock Inspector Pike called. He arrived with damp shoes, official gravity, and the air of a man who believed himself nearing a successful conclusion. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple." "Not at all, Inspector." Mrs. Bantry tactfully vanished, though not before positioning herself where she could overhear portions of the conversation through the partially open door. Inspector Pike seated himself. "I understand you were present yesterday. You observed the villagers closely?" "I generally do." The inspector hesitated. Like many policemen, he was uncertain whether Miss Marple represented valuable insight or troublesome interference. "We're proceeding carefully," he said. I'm sure. Still, local impressions can occasionally assist. Miss Marple waited. Pike cleared his throat. You know Lawrence Red? Only slightly. He admits he met Mrs. Colwyn privately yesterday before the murder. He also admits they quarreled. That was honest of him. The inspector frowned faintly. He cannot provide a proper account of his movements between 3:45 and 4 o'clock. Many people cannot account accurately for time during fêtes, said Miss Marple mildly. There is usually confusion over cakes. Pike ignored this. We believe Mrs. Colwyn may have been blackmailing him. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused briefly. Indeed? We found financial records suggesting recent withdrawals from his account. How sad. Inspector Pike leaned forward. You don't sound surprised. My dear Inspector, blackmail is extraordinarily common, much commoner than murder. Though less discussed at tea tables, Pike gave her a long look. You think we're mistaken. I think, said Miss Marple gently, that young men who commit crimes of passion generally behave differently afterward. How so? They are either excessively dramatic or excessively calm. Mr. Red yesterday appeared frightened. Well, naturally. No, said Miss Marple softly. Not naturally. Frightened people fear consequences. Guilty people fear discovery. There is a distinction. The inspector rose after a moment. You may be interested to know, he said carefully, that we intend to arrest Reed this afternoon. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. After he departed, Mrs. Bantry emerged instantly from the hallway. Well, they are arresting the wrong person. You sound certain. I am. Mrs. Bantry stared. My dear Jane, on what grounds? Miss Marple resumed knitting. Human nature. Mrs. Bantry gave the small, exasperated sigh of a woman long accustomed to such answers. That afternoon the arrest took place precisely as Inspector Pike had intended, publicly enough to satisfy the village. Lawrence Red was taken from his office near the Green shortly after 3 o'clock. Rain had ceased by then, and a surprising number of villagers discovered urgent reasons to pass nearby. Miss Marple watched discreetly from the window of the tea-rooms. Lawrence looked pale but controlled. Not shocked, not outraged, and not, Miss Marple thought, like a murderer. Sally Brent stood farther down the lane, clutching a parcel so tightly the paper had torn beneath her fingers. Their eyes met briefly. Something passed between them. Not romance, not exactly. Protection. Very interesting indeed. Later that evening Miss Marple paid a quiet call upon Ivy Cottage, where Beatrice Colwyn had lived. The cottage stood at the edge of the village beneath dripping elms, its small garden neglected after the previous day's rain. Inspector Pike had already searched the premises thoroughly, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that policemen often overlooked domestic details. A temporary housekeeper admitted her reluctantly. I'm only looking after things till relatives arrive. Yes, of course. The sitting-room remained much as Beatrice Colwyn had left it. Tasteful furniture, books neatly arranged, flowers beginning to fade in a blue vase. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room. Women revealed themselves in drawing-rooms far more honestly than men ever did in studies. There were signs here of restraint and control. Nothing sentimental. Nothing careless. Yet one detail struck her. The writing desk. A small silver frame stood upon it, empty. Miss Marple examined it closely. Recently occupied. Someone had removed a photograph. Her eyes drifted farther. Beside the blotter lay several torn scraps of paper in the wastebasket. Miss Marple bent delicately and retrieved one. Only part of a sentence remained visible. Cannot continue unless... Another fragment. He suspects. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Not love letters then. Fear again. Always fear. She was still considering the fragments when a movement outside the window caught her attention. Someone stood briefly near the garden gate. A woman. Tall. Mrs. Diana Weatherby. For one instant the two women looked directly at one another through the fading evening light. Then Mrs. Weatherby turned and walked away quickly into the lane. Miss Marple stood very still. And suddenly, quite suddenly, she began to suspect that the missing silver thimble might have very little to do with silver at all. Miss Marple slept poorly that night. Not because of fear. She had long ago discovered that fear rarely accompanied understanding, but because certain fragments of thought persisted in arranging themselves stubbornly at the back of her mind. A silver thimble, a dead woman, a frightened young solicitor, and Diana Weatherby standing outside Ivy Cottage like someone watching the edge of a precipice. By morning the rain had cleared, leaving Rosehill washed and deceptively innocent beneath pale sunshine. Sparrows hopped busily along hedges. Milk carts rattled peacefully through the lanes. One could almost have believed nothing dreadful had occurred. But villagers never forgot murder quickly. At breakfast Mrs. Bantry announced that Mrs. Harbury had taken to her bed from nerves, while Colonel Harbury had begun shouting at nearly everyone in sight, which, added Mrs. Bantry, buttering toast, seems to have improved his spirits considerably. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And Mrs. Weatherby? Mrs. Bantry looked up. Now there's an interesting point. Diana Weatherby has become remarkably quiet. Was she not quiet before? Oh yes, but elegantly quiet. This is different. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. She called yesterday evening. Said she felt terribly distressed about the murder, but the odd thing was, she seemed far more anxious than distressed. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Yes. You noticed it too? My dear, one notices anxiety because it is so contagious. Mrs. Bantry eyed her sharply. You suspect Diana Weatherby knows something. I suspect, said Miss Marple carefully, that Mrs. Weatherby is afraid of something. At 10:30 Miss Marple set out for a walk through the village. Walking, she often said, encouraged both circulation and truth. Rose Hill appeared unusually animated for a Tuesday morning. Small knots of villagers paused in conversation outside shops, lowering their voices as others passed. Curtains twitched discreetly. Even the baker's assistant displayed an expression suggesting privileged knowledge. Miss Marple exchanged greetings pleasantly while observing everything. Near the churchyard gate she encountered Dr. Haydock. Ah, Miss Marple. He removed his hat briefly. Out investigating human wickedness. Only hydrangeas this morning. The doctor laughed. I wish the police shared your restraint. Pike is entirely satisfied he has his man. You disagree? Haydock hesitated. I'm not certain. Reed had motive enough, perhaps, but there's something uncomfortable about the whole business. The doctor glanced around before lowering his voice. The autopsy suggests Mrs. Colwyn was killed slightly earlier than Pike first believed. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Oh, closer to 3:30 than 4. That is important. Quite. Does Inspector Pike consider it important? Haydock's silence answered adequately. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. Policemen, she reflected, sometimes resembled terriers. Once attached to the wrong object, they resisted all efforts at redirection. Did Mrs. Colwyn suffer? She asked quietly. No, said the doctor. Death was quick. They walked together a short distance along the lane. Tell me, said Miss Marple after a moment, what sort of woman did you think Mrs. Colwyn was? Haydock considered. Intelligent. Reserved. Nervous underneath. Nervous? Yeah. Not visibly, perhaps, but I'd have said she was living under strain. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That fitted. People living under strain developed habits, overcaution, sudden silences, careful smiles, fear again. As they approached the green, a motor car passed rather too quickly through the lane, scattering chickens and outrage simultaneously. Miss Marple recognized the driver at once. Chidrigvale. He was a London art dealer of uncertain prosperity who had lately appeared in Rose Hill with surprising frequency. Tall, dark-haired, and superficially charming, Mr. Vale possessed the dangerous gift of appearing trustworthy to women and successful to men. Mrs. Bantry had already described him as the sort of person who borrows money gracefully. The car disappeared toward Rose Hill Manor. Dr. Haydock frowned. Vale again? You dislike him? I distrust men who smile before they speak. Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement. She continued alone toward the post office. Florence? Hill naturally was delighted to see her. My dear Miss Marple, such extraordinary developments. There always were. Mrs. Hill lowered her voice theatrically. Mrs. Colwyn and Mr. Vale quarreled violently last Thursday. Did they? In the lane behind the manor. How unfortunate. And apparently Colonel Harbury saw them. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Indeed? Yes, though he refuses to discuss it. Mrs. Hill glanced around eagerly before continuing. There's talk that Mrs. Colwyn knew something about Mr. Vale. Villagers always believe people know things about one another, said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Hill looked disappointed by this moderation. But there's more, she insisted. Someone attempted to enter Ivy Cottage last night. Miss Marple became still. That is interesting. Was anything taken? The police aren't saying, but they had not known about Diana Weatherby's visit. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hill and departed slowly. By noon she had reached Rose Hill Manor. The great house stood beyond clipped hedges and old yew trees, handsome in a faded Edwardian fashion. Colonel Harbury received her in the library with visible impatience. "Miss Marple." He remained standing. "I understand you wish to speak with me." "Only briefly. About Mrs. Colwyn." Something hardened instantly in his face. "What about her? You knew her fairly well?" "I knew her as one knows people in villages." "Of course." The colonel moved abruptly toward the fireplace. "She was an attractive woman. Men paid attention to her. Villagers invent nonsense." Miss Marple watched him carefully. Embarrassment, but not grief. "Did she ever discuss the missing silver thimble with you?" The colonel's expression altered very slightly. "No." "Not even privately?" "No." Too quick. Miss Marple changed direction gently. "I understand Mr. Vale visited frequently." Harbury's mouth tightened. "Business matters." "Antiquus?" Miss Marple allowed a pause. Then softly, "Did Mrs. Colwyn know him before Rosehill?" The colonel looked up sharply. "I've no idea." Again too quick. Men often lied badly when protecting either pride or women. Sometimes both. A discreet knock interrupted them. Mrs. Harbury entered carrying tea with the tragic solemnity of a woman determined to suffer publicly. "My dear Miss Marple," she sighed, "this dreadful business has nearly destroyed us." "Yes, indeed." Mrs. Harbury seated herself immediately. "I scarcely sleep. Hugh is impossible. The servants are terrified, and the police constantly tramping through the house." "Edith," said the colonel sharply. She ignored him. Of course everyone trusted Beatrice completely. Though looking back one notices certain things. Miss Marple waited. She asked rather too many questions. "What sort of questions?" "Oh, village matters, financial matters, family histories." Mrs. Harbury lowered her voice, and she seemed oddly interested in the silver thimble. The colonel turned abruptly. "Edith, enough." But Miss Marple had already observed something valuable. Mrs. Harbury was afraid of her husband, not deeply perhaps, but genuinely, and frightened wives sometimes spoke carelessly. Miss Marple left shortly afterward. As she walked down the manor drive, she saw Diana Weatherby approaching through the gates. The two women paused. Mrs. Weatherby wore pale grey and carried gloves she twisted unconsciously between elegant fingers. "Miss Marple, Mistress Weatherby." For a moment neither spoke. Then Diana said quietly, "You were at Ivy Cottage yesterday. You should be careful." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "My dear, that is rarely useful advice after 70. A flicker of strained amusement crossed Diana's face, then vanished. "You don't understand what kind of woman Beatrice Colwyn was." "No?" "She was dangerous." The words emerged suddenly, almost violently. Miss Marple waited. Diana looked away toward the trees. She enjoyed knowing things about people. Weaknesses. "Blackmail?" Mrs. Weatherby flinched visibly. After a moment she said, "I didn't say that." "No." Diana drew a long breath. "There are matters in villages that ought to remain buried." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but they seldom do." For one terrible instant it seemed Mrs. Weatherby might say more. Instead she whispered, "If you value your peace of mind, leave this alone." Then she turned and walked rapidly toward the manor. Miss Marple remained standing in the lane. A thrush sang somewhere beyond the hedges, and suddenly, with that curious quiet certainty that occasionally came to her, Miss Marple realized something profoundly important. Beatrice Colwyn had not been murdered because of love, nor because of theft. She had been murdered because she knew something someone could not afford to have known. And somewhere inside the mystery of the missing silver thimble lay the key to the whole affair. That afternoon brought sunshine, and with sunshine came visitors. Villages, Miss Marple had often observed, behaved rather like disturbed ant-hills after scandal. Everyone moved with renewed purpose while accomplishing remarkably little. By 3 o'clock the Bantry's drawing-room had received Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, Florence Hill, and eventually Mrs. Harbury herself, each bearing fresh theories disguised as concern. Miss Marple listened with patient attention. Listening, after all, was far more profitable than speaking. "It is perfectly obvious," declared Mrs. Finch, "that Miss Colwyn was mixed up in something improper before she ever came to Rosehill." "Foreign connections," added Florence Hill darkly. Mrs. Bantry rolled her eyes. "My dear Florence, you suspect foreign connections whenever anyone wears silk?" Mrs. Harbury sighed heavily. "One simply never knows who people truly are." Miss Marple glanced at her. That particular remark carried genuine feeling. The conversation drifted inevitably toward Lawrence Red. "He looked dreadful when they took him away," said Mrs. Finch. "Well, naturally," replied Mrs. Harbury. "Murderers often do." Miss Marple spoke quietly for the first time in several minutes. "Not always." The room paused. Mrs. Harbury blinked. "You don't believe he killed her?" "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I have known several murderers in my lifetime. Most of them possessed one thing in common. A certain emotional simplicity." Mrs. Finch looked confused. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "People kill for reasons that appear enormous to themselves: love, humiliation, greed, fear. But afterward they generally behave in accordance with the emotion that drove them. Young Mr. Red behaves like a man trapped inside circumstances he does not understand." Mrs. Harbury shifted uncomfortably. "That sounds very dangerous." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "For him." There was a silence. Then Florence Hill said eagerly, "The police searched the pond behind Ivy Cottage this morning." Mrs. Bantry groaned. "They'll soon have dredged the entire county." "They were looking for the silver thimble." Miss Marple's needles paused very slightly. "Were they?" "Inspector Pike believes Mrs. Colwyn stole it and hid it somewhere." Mrs. Harbury nodded emphatically. "Exactly what Hugh says." "Does Colonel Harbury often agree with Inspector Pike?" asked Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Harbury hesitated. "Not usually." Interesting again. After the visitors departed, Mrs. Bantry shut the drawing-room door firmly. "Well," she said, "half the village now believes Beatrice Colwyn was either a jewel thief, a spy, or Lucrezia Borgia. Villagers enjoy enlarging wickedness. It makes their own sins feel manageable." Mrs. Bantry sat opposite her. "What are you thinking now, Jane?" Miss Marple considered before answering. "About small objects." "Small objects?" "Yes. They are remarkably dangerous." Mrs. Bantry laughed faintly. "My dear, you sound absurd." "Not at all. Poison is usually administered in very small quantities. Important letters fit neatly into pockets. Diamonds are hidden in buttons. And secrets." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Secrets are often concealed inside the tiniest things imaginable." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "You think there was something inside the silver thimble?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that people rarely kill for antiques." The evening brought another development. At 7:30 Inspector Pike himself arrived once more, looking considerably less satisfied than before. Mrs. Bantry admitted him with visible anticipation. "You've discovered something?" she announced before he had removed his coat. The inspector gave a weary sigh. Miss Marple looked up quietly. "About Lawrence Reed?" "In a way." He seated himself heavily. "We searched Mrs. Colwyn's cottage again." "And?" "We found evidence someone entered the house after the murder." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "I thought you might." Pike stared. "You knew?" "One notices disturbed flower beds." The inspector looked faintly irritated by this. "Nothing appears stolen," he continued. "But drawers had been searched. For papers, perhaps?" "That's our assumption." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did Mrs. Colwyn keep correspondence?" "Yes, though much seems missing." "Deliberately missing?" Pike gave her a sharp glance. "That's precisely the difficulty." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "So someone murdered her and then returned for documents?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said softly. "Or someone feared what the police might discover afterward." The inspector looked thoughtful for the first time. "There's another matter." He hesitated. "We questioned Cedric Vale this afternoon." Miss Marple watched him closely. "And?" "He admitted knowing Mrs. Colwyn before Rosehill." Mrs. Bantry gave a small gasp of triumph. "I knew it." "But," Pike continued, "he insists their acquaintance was entirely professional." "Which means it certainly was not," murmured Mrs. Bantry. Inspector Pike ignored her. "Apparently Mrs. Colwyn once worked briefly for an auction house in London." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "She possessed expertise in antiques." "Did she indeed?" Now matters began arranging themselves differently. The silver thimble, an antique dealer, a woman asking questions. Miss Marple felt the first distinct stirring of clarity. "Did Mr. Vale explain why they quarrelled?" she asked. "No." "Did you believe him?" Pike hesitated. "No." Silence settled briefly over the room. Outside, twilight deepened across the garden. Somewhere beyond the hedge a dog barked sharply. Then Miss Marple asked, "Inspector, where exactly was the silver thimble kept before it vanished?" "In a locked cabinet at Rosehill Manor." "Who possessed keys?" "Colonel Harbury." "Mrs. Harbury, the butler." "And who knew of the thimble's value?" Most of the village by now, said Pike dryly. Yes, but before? The inspector frowned thoughtfully. The Harburys certainly. Cedric Vale examined it recently. Mrs. Colwyn may have seen it during visits. Miss Marple nodded. And when did it disappear? 3 days before the fete. Precisely when did Mrs. Colwyn begin behaving nervously? Inspector Pike stared at her. I'm not sure, but someone in the village will know, said Miss Marple gently. People always notice nervousness in others. It reassures them about their own lives. The inspector rose slowly. You think the thimble itself matters more than we assumed. I think, said Miss Marple, that objects sometimes become important for reasons entirely unrelated to what they appear to be. After he departed, Mrs. Bantry turned immediately toward Miss Marple. You've got something in your head.
What?
Miss Marple smiled faintly. A memory
of what?
There was once a curate in St. Mary Mead who concealed betting debts inside hollow golf balls. Mrs. Bantry blinked. My dear Jane, what has that to do with murder? Only this. When people believe something is too ordinary to attract attention, they use it to hide the things they fear most. Mrs. Bantry opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak the front bell rang violently. A maid entered looking alarmed. There's a young lady asking for Miss Marple, ma'am. Who is it? Asked Mrs. Bantry. The maid hesitated. She says her name is Sally Brent. A moment later Sally entered the drawing-room. The girl looked exhausted. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched her handbag with desperate force. Miss Marple, she whispered. I didn't know where else to go. Miss Marple rose gently. My dear child, sit down. Sally sat but remained visibly trembling. They're going to hang him. Mrs. Bantry made a distressed sound. You mean Lawrence Red? Sally nodded miserably. He didn't kill Mrs. Colwyn. I know he didn't, Miss Marple said quietly. How do you know? The girl looked toward the door as though afraid someone might overhear. Then she whispered, Because at the time she died, he was with me. The room became perfectly still. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Why did you not tell the police? Sally burst suddenly into tears. Because Larry begged me not to. Why? The girl covered her face. Because if people knew where we were, they'd know we meant to run away together. For a few moments only Sally's quiet sobbing filled the room. Then Miss Marple asked the truly important question. And what, she said softly, was Mrs. Colwyn threatening him about? Sally Brent cried for several minutes before she could speak coherently again. Miss Marple did not interrupt her. Young people in distress, she had found, often revealed more truth in silence than in questioning. Mrs. Bantry hovered sympathetically with smelling salts and tea, though Sally accepted neither. At last the girl lowered her hands. I know how it looks, she whispered. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, appearances are usually designed to mislead. Sally gave her a quick, uncertain glance, as though startled by kindness. Mrs. Bantry sat down beside her. You say Lawrence Reed was with you yesterday afternoon? For how long? From before 3:30 until nearly 5. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That matched Dr. Haydock's revised estimate of the time of death almost exactly. Where were you? She asked. Sally flushed scarlet. In the old boat shed near Miller's farm. Mrs. Bantry coughed delicately. Miss Marple merely inclined her head, and Mr. Reed wished to avoid scandal. The girl twisted her gloves nervously. He said if people discovered we were planning to leave together, his uncle would dismiss him from the firm immediately. Was that likely? Oh, yeah. Mr. Reed's uncle cares terribly about respectability. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. Respectability, she reflected, had ruined nearly as many lives as wickedness. And Mrs. Colwyn knew of this arrangement? Sally hesitated. I think so. You think or no? Sally swallowed. She saw us together once, a few weeks ago, and afterward she spoke to Larry privately. Miss Marple watched the girl carefully. What was the nature of their acquaintance? I don't know exactly. Sally's voice trembled again. But Larry was frightened of her. Not hatred, not jealousy. Again that same thread. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What did Mrs. Colwyn threaten him with? Sally looked miserable. She said she could destroy his future. How? I don't know. Miss Marple believed her. People involved in blackmail frequently concealed details even from those they loved. Shame preferred darkness. Mrs. Bantry spoke suddenly. But if Lawrence has an alibi, why not go directly to the inspector? Sally gave a small, desperate shake of the head. Because Larry refuses. He says if I speak now, things will become worse." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did he explain why?" "No." Sally hesitated. "Only that other people would be hurt." That interested Miss Marple very much indeed. She rose quietly and crossed toward the window. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the Bantry's garden. Somewhere in the distance church bells marked the quarter hour. Other people would be hurt. That was not the statement of a selfish man protecting reputation. It was the statement of someone protecting another person. Miss Marple turned back. "My dear Sally, I think you have been very brave." The girl looked near tears again. "What should I do?" "For the moment, nothing. If Inspector Pike arrests the wrong man entirely," said Miss Marple gently, "it may encourage the right one to grow careless." Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "You already know who did it?" "No." Which was true. But she was beginning to know the shape of the truth. After Sally departed by the side gate to avoid village attention, Mrs. Bantry rounded instantly upon Miss Marple. "Well—" "Yes, you were right about Lawrence Red." Miss Marple resumed her knitting. One usually is when paying attention. Mrs. Bantry ignored this calmly irritating statement. "But what now?" "Now," said Miss Marple, "we must ask why a frightened young solicitor would rather risk a murder charge than reveal the truth." Mrs. Bantry stared. "My dear Jane, you think the secret matters more than the murder." "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "the secret caused the murder." The following morning brought a thin mist over Rose Hill. Miss Marple walked early through the village lanes, partly for exercise, and partly because milkmen, gardeners, and charwomen often possessed information unavailable elsewhere. It was near the churchyard that she encountered Ellen Briggs, formerly parlourmaid at Rosehill Manor. Ellen had retired some years earlier, but continued to supplement her income by cleaning silver for village households. An observant woman, Miss Marple recalled, and observant women notice things. After suitable conversation regarding arthritis and damp weather, Miss Marple asked mildly, "The theft at the manor must have upset everyone greatly." Ellen sniffed. "That silver thimble caused more trouble than it was worth." "Oh? Well, people arguing over it all week." Miss Marple stopped gently. "Arguing?" Ellen realized too late she had said too much. "Oh, nothing, miss. My dear Ellen, old servants always know what matters. It is one of the pillars of English society." The compliment worked admirably. Ellen lowered her voice. "Mr. Vale came to the manor twice before the thing vanished." "Yes?" "And after the second visit, Colonel Harbury and him had words. Loud ones. About the thimble?" "I believe so." "Did Mrs. Colwyn ever see it?"
"Oh, yes."
"Ask questions about it, too." "What sort of questions?" Ellen frowned. "Not about value exactly. More where it came from." Miss Marple became very still. "Did that surprise you?" "Yes," said Ellen slowly. "Because everyone already knew where it came from." "And where was that?" "Belonged to the Colonel's grandmother. Been in the family years." Yet Beatrice Colwyn had questioned its origin. Miss Marple thanked Ellen and continued slowly along the lane. "A thing easily hidden." That was what troubled her now. Not jewels, not money. Documents, perhaps, or names. She recalled suddenly an old case in St. Mary Mead involving forged ration certificates hidden inside the hollow base of a Victorian salt shaker. Such concealments were absurdly common among nervous people, and Beatrice Colwyn had certainly been nervous. As Miss Marple turned toward the green, she saw Cedric Vale emerging from the post office. He looked elegant despite the muddy roads, his dark coat perfectly cut, his smile charming. But his eyes changed slightly when he saw her. Not fear exactly, calculation. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "out enjoying village tranquillity. It has been somewhat interrupted lately." "Indeed." He lit a cigarette with careful hands. "A dreadful business about Mrs. Colwyn. You knew her well?" "Moderately. She once worked in antiques, I believe." Vale's gaze flickered almost imperceptibly. "So the police told you? One hears many things in villages." "Yes," he said dryly. "That is precisely what makes them dangerous." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Dangerous for whom?" For the first time his composure slipped slightly. "Only slightly, but enough." "Surely," he said lightly, "you don't suspect me of murder?" "My dear Mr. Vale, I never suspect anyone quickly. Human beings are far too complicated." "An admirable philosophy." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "though murder itself is usually quite simple." Their eyes met briefly. Then Vale smiled again. "Good morning, Miss Marple." As he walked away, Miss Marple noticed something odd. His gloves, dark leather, and along one finger ran the faintest streak of silver polish. That afternoon Inspector Pike returned to Ivy Cottage with 2 constables. Word spread through Rosehill within minutes. By 4 o'clock half the village had discovered reasons to pass nearby. Miss Marple arrived quietly a little later and found the inspector in visible frustration. "We've found nothing," he muttered. "Were you expecting to?" "What precisely?" Pike hesitated. "Hidden compartments." Miss Marple glanced slowly around the cottage sitting-room. The faded flowers remained on the table. The empty photograph frame still stood upon the desk, and suddenly something else struck her. A sewing-basket near the fireplace, ordinary enough, yet curiously untouched. Miss Marple crossed toward it. Did Mrs. Colwyn sew? "What?" She possessed excellent clothing. Such women generally mend things carefully. The inspector looked baffled. "I suppose so." Miss Marple opened the basket gently. Cotton reels, embroidery scissors, and several thimbles, brass, but no silver. She lifted one thoughtfully. Then she saw it. Inside the basket lid was a tiny tear in the lining. Not accidental, deliberate. Miss Marple slipped one finger beneath the fabric carefully. Something crackled. Paper. Inspector Pike came sharply forward. "What is it?" Miss Marple withdrew a small folded envelope. Very thin, very carefully concealed. The inspector took it quickly and opened it. Inside lay a single sheet of paper covered in names and dates. For several seconds Pike stared without speaking. Then his face altered completely. "My God!" "What is it?" asked Miss Marple quietly. The inspector looked up slowly. "They're records." "Of what?" He swallowed. "Forgery transactions, illegal sales, antiques." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Now it was beginning to fit. But one name on the paper mattered more than all the others, because written near the bottom in unmistakable ink was Chedrick Valley. Inspector Pike did not speak for nearly half a minute. He remained standing beside the sewing-basket, the folded paper in his hand, staring at the list of names as though it had altered the shape of the room itself, which Miss Marple reflected in a sense it had. The inspector finally drew a long breath. "Well—" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. Pike looked again at the paper. The document contained dates, initials, locations, and brief notes in Beatrice Colwyn's precise handwriting. To an ordinary eye it might have appeared meaningless, but to anyone familiar with police records or human dishonesty it revealed something rather ugly. Forged antique provenance, smuggling, private sales of stolen items, and always recurring like a stain beneath water. Chedrick Valley. The inspector folded the paper carefully. "This changes matters considerably." "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "murder frequently changes matters." Pike almost smiled despite himself. "For once," he admitted, "I think you may have been ahead of us." Miss Marple did not point out that she usually was. Instead she said, "Mrs. Colwyn discovered something, and became frightened." The inspector nodded slowly. "She may have intended to expose Vale, or blackmail him." Pike frowned. "You think so?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that frightened people sometimes try to convert danger into safety. Money often appears safer than knowledge." The inspector looked thoughtful. "That would explain Lawrence Red. He may have discovered part of it." "Precisely." Pike straightened abruptly. "I'm bringing Vale in for questioning immediately." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing." "Yes?" "We still haven't found the silver thimble." Miss Marple looked at the sewing-basket. "No," she said softly, "but I think we are getting closer." Vale received the news of the police inquiry with admirable composure. Too admirable, Miss Marple thought later. Perfect self-control often indicated either innocence or long experience. The questioning took place at the temporary police office established in the Rosehill council rooms. By evening the village already buzzed with speculation intense enough to power London. Mrs. Hill informed Mrs. Finch. Mrs. Finch informed the butcher's wife. The butcher's wife informed practically everyone else. By supper-time Cedric Vale had become either the head of an international criminal organization or a jewel thief operating from Monte Carlo. Villagers embroidered facts with extraordinary speed. Miss Marple spent the evening quietly at the Bantrys, listening while Mrs. Bantry read aloud portions of the Times, and complained that murder invariably ruined digestion. At 8:30 there came another visitor, Diana Weatherby. She entered pale and visibly strained, though still impeccably dressed. "My apologies for calling so late." "Not at all," said Mrs. Bantry eagerly, scenting developments. Diana sat down slowly. "I understand Inspector Pike questioned Mr. Vale today." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. For a moment Diana seemed uncertain whether to continue. Then she said abruptly, "He is dangerous." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Dangerous how?" Diana clasped her hands tightly. "He lies very well." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You know him well?" "No." Too quick again. Interesting how often fear accelerated speech. "But you knew Mrs. Colwyn well?" A pause. "No," Diana said quietly. "Not well." That, Miss Marple suspected, was the first entirely truthful statement of the evening. Mrs. Bantry tactfully announced a need to inspect the kitchen, though her departure radiated unwilling sacrifice. The moment they were alone, Diana spoke suddenly. "You must persuade Inspector Pike to stop—" "Stop what?" "Digging into things." "My dear Mrs. Weatherby," said Miss Marple gently, "that is unfortunately what policemen are designed for." Diana rose and crossed toward the window. "You don't understand." "No? There are people in this village whose lives would be destroyed." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Destroyed by exposure or by truth?" Diana turned sharply. "Is there a difference?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "A very great difference." For several seconds the younger woman said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, "Beatrice enjoyed power over people. She liked discovering weaknesses. Many lonely people do." Diana looked startled by the remark. Miss Marple continued quietly, "Knowledge can become a substitute for affection, particularly among women who feel insecure." Something flickered across Diana's face. Recognition, perhaps, or pity. "You speak as though you understood her." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "one understands nearly everyone eventually." Diana lowered her eyes. Then she said the curious thing. "She wasn't entirely wicked." Miss Marple became very still. There it was again. Not hatred, complication. Human beings were rarely consistent enough for pure emotions. "She frightened you," Miss Marple said softly. Diana closed her eyes briefly. "Why?" No answer came. Instead, Diana whispered, "If you discover the truth, some people will suffer terribly." Then she left abruptly before Miss Marple could stop her. Mrs. Bantry returned almost instantly from the hallway. "Well?" "She is terrified." "Of Vale?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No." "Then of what?" Miss Marple resumed knitting. "The past?" The following morning Inspector Pike arrived looking grimly satisfied. "We've confirmed parts of the list," he announced. Miss Marple poured tea calmly. "And Mr. Vale?" "He admits dealing in questionable antiques, but denies murder." "Naturally. He claims Mrs. Colwyn tried to extort money from him." "That may even be true." Pike frowned. "You're remarkably charitable toward blackmailers." "My dear Inspector, blackmail is simply cowardice mixed with opportunity." "And murder?" "Usually fear mixed with desperation." The inspector sat down heavily. "There's more." "Yes?" "We searched Vale's rooms at the Crown Hotel. We found correspondence from Mrs. Colwyn demanding money." Mrs. Bantry looked triumphant. "There!" But Miss Marple remained thoughtful. "How much money?" "Several £1,000s." Pike blinked. "Interesting?" "Yes, because professional blackmailers generally ask for manageable sums repeatedly. Large demands suggest panic." The inspector stared at her. "You think Mrs. Colwyn was desperate?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "something changed recently." The room fell silent. Then Pike said, "We also discovered another thing." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. When he unfolded it, Mrs. Bantry gasped. It was a silver thimble, beautifully worked, and faintly tarnished. "The missing thimble!" cried Mrs. Bantry. Inspector Pike nodded grimly. "We found it hidden inside Vale's luggage." Mrs. Bantry looked positively radiant with vindication. But Miss Marple did not move. Something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just. She held out her hand. "May I?" The inspector passed her the thimble. Miss Marple turned it gently beneath the light. Intricately engraved, and then she noticed something odd, a tiny imperfection near the rim. No, not imperfection, a seam, very slight, almost invisible. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly. "My dear Inspector," she said softly, "did you examine the inside?" "The inside?" Pike took the thimble back, frowning. After several awkward moments he discovered the mechanism almost by accident. The top unscrewed. Mrs. Bantry gave a gasp. Inside the hollow silver thimble lay a tightly rolled fragment of paper. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Inspector Pike carefully withdrew it. The paper was yellowed with age, and upon it, written in faded ink decades earlier, was a name. Not Cedric Vale, not Beatrice Colwyn. Hugh Harbry. Underneath the name appeared another line. Paid in full October 1921. And beneath that, Ashcombe Collection. Inspector Pike stared blankly. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered. But Miss Marple felt a small cold certainty settle quietly into place, because now at last she understood why Colonel Harbry had been afraid. For several moments after the paper was discovered, nobody spoke at all. The little scrap of yellowed writing seemed somehow to alter the air in the room. Inspector Pike stared at it with growing confusion. "Mrs. Bantry said finally, I don't understand any of it." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "But I think Colonel Harbry does." The inspector looked up sharply. "You know what this means?" "Not entirely, but enough to recognize its importance." Pike frowned at the faded note again. "Hugh Harbry, paid in full. Ashcombe Collection." He shook his head impatiently. "It could refer to anything." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but it does not." The inspector gave her a slightly irritated glance, the expression of a man confronting someone who already stood 3 pages ahead in the story. "You believe the thimble was used to conceal this document?"
"Oh, yes."
"But why?" "Because whoever placed it there believed the paper valuable." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Valuable in what way?" Miss Marple folded her hands carefully. "My dear Dolly, people rarely hide evidence of ordinary purchases inside antique silver." Inspector Pike rose abruptly. "I'm going to Rose Hill Manor." Colonel Harbry received the inspector in the library with controlled hostility. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry accompanied Pike, though Mrs. Bantry later claimed this occurred accidentally and entirely through coincidence. The colonel stood beside the fireplace in military rigidity, while rain clouds gathered once more beyond the tall windows. "What now?" he demanded. Inspector Pike produced the folded paper without ceremony. "We found this inside the silver thimble." For the first time since Miss Marple had known him, Hugh Harbry lost complete control of his expression. Only briefly, but enough. His face drained of color. Mrs. Harbry, seated near the window, gave a faint cry. "Hugh?" The colonel recovered almost instantly. "I've never seen it before." A poor answer. Too quick again. Miss Marple noticed the tiny pulse beating violently near his temple. Inspector Pike said sharply, "What was the Ashcombe Collection?" No answer came. The silence stretched. Then Mrs. Harbry whispered. The colonel turned toward her sharply, but she was staring at the paper with genuine horror. Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. "You know what it refers to?" Mrs. Harbry pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. "It was years ago." "How many years?" asked Pike. "After the war," she whispered. "Just after." Colonel Harbry spoke suddenly.
"That's enough."
"No," said Inspector Pike firmly. "I don't think it is." For a long moment the colonel stood rigidly motionless. Then something inside him appeared to collapse inward. He sat down heavily. "The Ashcombe Collection," he said quietly, "was a private estate auction in 1921. Miss Marple waited. There were financial difficulties after the war. Families selling heirlooms, paintings. "And," said Pike. The colonel stared at the floor. "There were rumors afterward that certain items had disappeared before cataloguing. Stolen?" Mrs. Harbry shut her eyes.
"Oh, Hugh!"
The colonel's voice hardened defensively. "It was chaos after the war. Everyone desperate. Debts everywhere." Inspector Pike said, "You stole from the collection?"
"No!"
The answer came violently. Then more quietly, "I purchased items privately before cataloguing. Unofficially." Miss Marple spoke gently. "Without proper documentation." The colonel looked at her bitterly. "And the silver thimble?" "One of the items." Inspector Pike frowned. "But why conceal this paper inside it?" Harbry gave a harsh laugh. "Because the man who sold it to me insisted on keeping records."
"What man?"
The colonel hesitated. "Cedric Vale's father." Silence filled the library. Miss Marple felt another piece slide quietly into place. Inspector Pike said slowly, "Vale's father dealt in stolen antiques, and your purchase was illegal." The colonel looked exhausted suddenly. "It was 25 years ago, but Mrs. Colwyn discovered it," said Miss Marple softly. The colonel looked up sharply. There it was at last. Truth always altered people physically. Shoulders lowered. Faces aged. Voices changed. "How?" asked Pike. "She recognized the hallmark inside the thimble," Harbury muttered. "Said it belonged to the Ashcombe records." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That explained the questions about provenance. Mrs. Colwyn had not cared about value. She had cared about history. "What happened then?" asked the inspector. Harbury rubbed one hand across his face. She began asking questions about Vale, about his father, about old sales. "And you became frightened." Mrs. Harbury spoke suddenly through tears. "Hugh thought it would ruin us." The colonel turned sharply. "It might have." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. No murderer, she thought. Weak, perhaps, proud, frightened of disgrace, but not a killer. Inspector Pike asked the essential question. "Did Mrs. Colwyn threaten to expose you?" The colonel hesitated. "Demand money?" "No." Miss Marple looked up quickly. "Not money?" Harbury shook his head slowly. "She wanted information. About Vale?" That mattered enormously, because blackmailers sought advantage, investigators sought truth, and perhaps Beatrice Colwyn had been less simple than anyone imagined. Miss Marple said quietly, "She was afraid of Cedric Vale." The colonel stared. "How did you know?" "Because she pressed too hard." He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "She believed Vale possessed documents connected to old theft, names, transactions, and she wanted them?" "Why?" Harbury looked genuinely puzzled. "I don't know." But Miss Marple thought perhaps she did. Later that evening Miss Marple sat alone in the Bantrys' drawing-room while rain tapped softly against the windows. Mrs. Bantry had gone upstairs with a headache produced equally by scandal and excitement. The fire burned low. Miss Marple knitted steadily. Not blackmail then, or not entirely. Beatrice Colwyn had been searching for something. Documents, perhaps. But why? The answer came unexpectedly from memory. A woman in St. Mary Mead years earlier. Quiet, respectable, nervous. Her brother had died in prison because of forged financial records created by another man entirely. She had spent 15 years trying to clear his name. Miss Marple became very still. What if Beatrice Colwyn had not sought money? What if she had sought justice? The idea changed everything. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sally Brent entered hesitantly. "My apologies, Miss Marple. My dear child, come in." Sally looked pale again. "I heard they found the thimble. Does that help Lawrence?" "Eventually, I think." The girl clasped her hands anxiously. "There's something else I didn't tell you." Miss Marple waited quietly. Sally swallowed. "The day before the murder, I saw Mrs. Colwyn arguing with Mrs. Weatherby." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Where?" "In the churchyard." "What about?" "I only heard part of it." "And?" Sally hesitated. "Mrs. Colwyn said you should have told the truth years ago." Miss Marple's knitting stopped completely. "And what did Mrs. Weatherby say?" the girl whispered. "She said you don't understand what he's capable of." Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills. Miss Marple sat very still, because suddenly, quite suddenly, the entire case shifted shape once again. Not Cedric Vale alone. Not Colonel Harbury alone. Something older. Something hidden for years beneath the quiet surface of Rose Hill. And somewhere inside Diana Weatherby's terror lay the final truth about murder. Rain continued through the night. By morning Rose Hill seemed wrapped in a grey stillness that suited the mood of the village perfectly. Curtains remained drawn later than usual. Shopkeepers spoke in subdued tones. Even the church bells sounded distant and uncertain beneath the clouds. Miss Marple sat beside the drawing-room fire after breakfast, her knitting untouched in her lap, which, Mrs. Bantry knew from experience, meant serious thinking. "You've hardly made a stitch in 20 minutes," she observed. "That's always alarming." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, one cannot knit and arrange human wickedness simultaneously." Mrs. Bantry poured coffee. "You think Sally's story matters enormously?" "I do." "The argument in the churchyard?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "But what does it mean? You should have told the truth years ago." "About what?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. "That," she said softly, "is beginning to become clearer." A maid entered with a morning post. Among the letters lay one addressed in an elegant but visibly hurried hand. Miss Marple opened it quietly. Inside was a brief note. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you privately. Please come to Willow House at 11, if possible. Diana Weatherby." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward immediately. "Well?" "Mistress Weatherby wishes to see me." That sounds promising." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It sounds frightened." Willow House stood near the edge of the village, partly concealed behind tall hedges and dripping chestnut trees. It was an attractive house in a restrained way, very much like Diana Weatherby herself. A maid admitted Miss Marple quietly. "Mrs. Weatherby waited in the morning-room beside untouched tea. She looked exhausted, not merely anxious now, worn, as though fear had finally become heavier than concealment." "Thank you for coming." Miss Marple sat down. "My dear Mrs. Weatherby, I think you have wished to speak for some time." Diana gave a strained smile. For a few moments neither woman spoke. Then Diana said abruptly, "Beatrice Colwyn was not the person people believed." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "I rather think she wasn't." Diana looked relieved by the answer. "She came to Rosehill for a reason. She wasn't interested in village life or bridge parties or any of the nonsense everyone assumed." Miss Marple waited. "She came because of Cedric Vale." There it was, plainly at last. "Tell me," said Miss Marple gently. Diana stood and moved restlessly toward the window. "Years ago, before my husband died, there was a man named Adrian Colwyn." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Mistress Colwyn's husband?" Diana's hands tightened together. "He worked briefly with antique dealers in London. Respectable people, or so everyone thought. And Cedric Vale's father?" Diana nodded. "There were illegal sales, forged histories, stolen collections moved quietly through private buyers. The Ashcombe collection." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And Adrian Colwyn was blamed." Diana turned sharply. "How did you know?" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "villages teach one a great deal about scapegoats." Diana closed her eyes briefly. "He died before anything could be proved properly. Ruined. And Beatrice believed him innocent." There was pain in Diana's voice now. Old pain. She spent years trying to uncover what truly happened. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Not blackmail then. Justice. But justice, she reflected, could become dangerous when pursued among guilty people. She discovered Colonel Harbury's connection, and Cedric Vale inherited his father's business. Diana sat down again heavily. He was cleverer than his father, more careful. But Mrs. Colwyn found evidence. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "And where do you fit into all this, Mrs. Weatherby?" The question hung quietly between them. Diana lowered her eyes. "My husband invested money with Vale's father after the war." "Illegally." A tiny nod. "He knew some items were questionable. And afterward? When the scandal threatened, everyone denied involvement. Adrian Colwyn suffered for it." Miss Marple said softly, "But your husband knew the truth. And so did you." Diana whispered. Silence filled the room. Rain ticked faintly against the windows. Miss Marple understood now why Diana had looked relieved at the orchard. Not relief at death. Relief that exposure might finally be over. "How long had Mrs. Colwyn known?" asked Miss Marple. "Only weeks. And she confronted you." "What did she want?" Diana looked suddenly miserable. There it was again. Not money. Not advantage. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. Truth was admirable, but it had an unfortunate tendency to destroy fragile people. "What happened the day of the fete?" she asked quietly. Diana became very still. "I don't know." Miss Marple believed that she believed it, but not entirely. "You met Mrs. Colwyn in the orchard?" Diana looked startled. "How?" "You looked relieved afterward." A flush rose slowly into Diana's pale face. "Yes," she whispered, "but not because she died. No, I met her briefly near the orchard before the murder." "What did she say?" Diana hesitated. "She told me she finally had proof." Miss Marple felt a faint chill. "What sort of proof?" "She didn't say exactly. Only that Cedric Vale would be finished once the police saw it." "The paper inside the thimble?" "I don't know." Miss Marple considered. "Number. Not enough. That paper implicated Harbury and Vale's father, but not murder. There must have been something else, something Beatrice Colwyn either discovered or believed she had discovered shortly before her death." "Did anyone overhear your conversation?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't think so." "But you feared someone might." Diana gave a small, desperate laugh. "I feared everything by then." Miss Marple rose slowly. "One last question." "Yes?" "Why were you afraid of Cedric Vale personally?" Diana stared at her. Then very quietly, "Because he knew about my husband, and threatened exposure?" A pause. "No." Miss Marple waited. Finally Diana whispered, "He threatened my son." Now that, Miss Marple thought, sounded much more like Cedric Vale. Inspector Pike arrived at the Bantry's cottage shortly after luncheon. He looked tired and irritable. "Vale has an alibi," Mrs. Bantry groaned. "Oh, honestly." Pike removed his coat impatiently. 3 separate witnesses place him inside the Crown Hotel lounge at 3:30. Miss Marple said quietly, "The estimated time of death." The inspector sat down heavily. "And if Dr. Haydock is correct, Vale couldn't have killed her." Mrs. Bantry looked appalled. "But he must have." "Must he?" asked Miss Marple softly. Pike frowned at her. "You think someone else used the situation conveniently?" "Possibly." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "Then what was Vale hiding? Illegal dealings, certainly, but not murder." Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because something else troubled her now. Something small, very small, a psychological detail. Finally she asked, "Inspector, who discovered the body first?" "Mrs. Finch and Colonel Harbury almost simultaneously." "And who screamed?" Pike blinked. "Screamed?" "At the orchard," the inspector thought. "Mrs. Finch, I believe." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That was what bothered her, because genuine killers rarely screamed first, but frightened witnesses often did. And suddenly another thought came quietly into place. Not planned murder, perhaps. Not even deliberate murder. She looked up. "Inspector," she said gently, "did anyone examine Mrs. Colwyn's hands carefully?" Pike frowned. "Why?" "Were there signs?" she struggled. "A few superficial scratches." "On whom?" The inspector stared. Then his expression changed abruptly. "My God!" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is exactly what worries me." Inspector Pike left the Bantry's cottage with considerably more speed than dignity. Mrs. Bantry watched from the window as he hurried down the lane. "Well," she said, "you've upset him." Miss Marple resumed knitting placidly. "Policemen dislike returning to beginnings. It suggests wasted effort. But what exactly have you realized?" Miss Marple counted stitches carefully before answering. "Only that murder committed during panic looks rather different from murder committed deliberately." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You mean Mrs. Colwyn fought with someone unexpectedly, and scratched them?" "Quite possibly." Mrs. Bantry sat down heavily. "But then why the scarf? Why make it appear deliberate?" Miss Marple looked up quietly. "Because frightened people often attempt to improve reality afterward." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "My dear Jane, that sounds extraordinarily sinister." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Only human." By evening the village had acquired yet another current of nervous excitement. Inspector Pike, having rediscovered the usefulness of proper police work, had apparently begun examining villages with renewed enthusiasm. Several people were questioned again. Vale became suddenly less cooperative. Colonel Harbury lost his temper twice in public, and Mrs. Finch, who possessed the spiritual resilience of damp tissue paper, dissolved into tears merely upon seeing a constable walk past her gate. Miss Marple spent most of the afternoon in quiet reflection. The pieces existed now, but they did not yet arrange themselves properly. That always mattered. Truth possessed symmetry. Human lies did not. It was near 6 o'clock when Dr. Haydock called unexpectedly. He entered carrying fatigue and wet weather together. "You are right," he announced without preamble. Miss Marple looked up. "About the scratches?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Whose scratches?" Haydock removed his gloves slowly. "Diana Weatherby's." Silence settled over the room. Mrs. Bantry gave a faint gasp. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not surprise. Confirmation. "Where were they?" she asked quietly. "Along the wrist and lower hand. Recent enough to match." Mrs. Bantry looked horrified. "But Diana Weatherby couldn't possibly. She says she caught herself on garden wire," Haydock interrupted dryly. "Which is nonsense," said Miss Marple gently. The doctor sat down heavily. "Pike questioned her this afternoon. She nearly collapsed." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved thoughtfully. "Did she confess?" "No." "But she's frightened, terrified." Mrs. Bantry stared from one to the other. "You don't really think she killed Mrs. Colwyn?" Miss Marple said quietly, "I think Mrs. Weatherby believes she may have." That night Miss Marple slept very little. The problem now was not evidence. It was psychology. Diana Weatherby was afraid, but not with the fear of a calculating killer. Rather with the horror of someone trapped inside a terrible accident. Yet something still failed to fit. Because accidents did not usually produce hidden evidence, false suspicions, and manipulated scenes afterward. Someone else had moved through the story. someone practical, someone cold enough to use confusion advantageously. At 8:30 the next morning the answer arrived. Sally Brent came running breathlessly up the Bantry's path. "Miss Marple." The girl looked genuinely frightened.
"What is it, child?"
"It's Mr. Vale." Miss Marple became still.
"What about him?"
"I saw him last night outside Willow House. Mrs. Weatherby's home?" Sally swallowed hard. "They were arguing." Miss Marple rose quietly. "Did you hear anything?" "Only one thing."
"Why?"
Sally's voice dropped. He said, "You've already helped ruin one person. Don't make it worse." For a moment nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple asked softly, "And Mrs. Weatherby?" She said, "Leave my son out of this." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, now it became clearer. Fear layered upon fear. Old guilt, new manipulation, and Cedric, Vale standing precisely where such men always stood beside weakness, pressing upon it. Inspector Pike arrived shortly afterward, looking grim. "We're bringing Diana Weatherby informally." Mrs. Bantry protested instantly.
"Oh, surely not."
Pike looked unhappy himself. "The evidence is becoming difficult to ignore," Miss Marple said quietly. "She met Mrs. Colwyn shortly before death. She bears scratches consistent with struggle. She concealed information." The inspector spread his hands. "What else am I supposed to think?" Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "That perhaps someone wishes you to think exactly those things." Pike frowned. "You believe Vale is manipulating her?" "I believe," said Miss Marple softly, "that Cedric Vale understands frightened people extremely well." The inspector hesitated. He had opportunity afterward, perhaps, to tamper with evidence, but not to commit the murder itself. "No." Pike rubbed his forehead. "Then what happened in the orchard?" Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. "I think Mrs. Colwyn confronted Diana Weatherby with the truth about the past, the Ashcombe affair, and Diana panicked. Quite possibly." "Mrs. Bantry said faintly, "But panic alone doesn't kill people." "No," said Miss Marple quietly, "but struggles do." The room fell silent. Then Pike asked, "You think it was accidental?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she said, "When decent people commit terrible acts suddenly, they often become strangely passive afterward. Their minds stop functioning normally." "And Diana Weatherby?" "She looked relieved after the body was found," said Miss Marple softly. "Not because Beatrice Colwyn was dead, but because the dreadful moment itself was over." Inspector Pike stared thoughtfully at the carpet. "But if Diana caused the death accidentally," he said slowly, "who arranged the scarf?" Miss Marple looked up at him. At last, the truly important question. It was raining again by afternoon when Miss Marple went to Willow House. A maid admitted her reluctantly. Mrs. Weatherby waited upstairs in a darkened sitting-room. She looked exhausted beyond concealment now. The elegant composure had finally cracked. "Inspector Pike says you wish to see me," Diana said quietly. Miss Marple sat opposite her. For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said gently, "My dear, I think you must tell the truth now." Diana shut her eyes. "I can't." "Yes, you can." "No." Her voice trembled violently. "You don't understand." "I think I do." Diana rose abruptly and moved toward the fireplace. She came to the orchard furious. "Mrs. Colwyn?" Diana pressed trembling hands together. "She said she had proof against Cedric Vale. Proof my husband helped conceal the old thefts." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "And then?" "She said if I didn't speak publicly, she would." The words burst out almost desperately. "She said my son would grow up learning his father had been a coward." Miss Marple remained silent. Diana's breathing became uneven. "I begged her not to destroy him, not my son, and Mrs. Colwyn refused." A tear slipped suddenly down Diana's face. "We argued." She tried to walk away. I caught her arm. Miss Marple's voice remained very soft. "And?" She pulled free. Diana covered her mouth shakily. We both slipped on the wet grass. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Of course, the rain, the slope beneath the orchard trees. "She struck her head?" asked Miss Marple quietly. Diana nodded miserably. Against the stone edging near the apple trees, silence filled the room. Then Diana whispered. She wasn't moving. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "What happened afterward?" Diana stared at her in horror. "That's the terrible thing." "Yes?" "I ran." Miss Marple became very still, because now she knew. If Diana fled, someone else arrived afterward. Miss Marple left Willow House slowly beneath steady rain. The lane glistened darkly beneath the trees, and the village beyond seemed wrapped in a curious hush, as though Rose Hill itself waited uneasily for revelation. Diana Weatherby had told the truth, or enough of it. Miss Marple felt certain of that now. Not the entire truth, perhaps human beings almost never manage that, but the emotional truth, the sort recognizable immediately to anyone experienced in guilt. Diana had not meant to kill Beatrice Colwyn. There had been fear, shame, anger, panic, then a fall, a blow to the head, and afterward terror. Entirely believable, but not the scarf. Never the scarf. Miss Marple walked carefully through the rain, her thoughts moving with unusual clarity now. Someone else entered the orchard after Diana fled. Someone who saw opportunity. Someone practical enough to understand instantly what a dead or dying woman might mean. Not accidental death. Murder. Murder created confusion. And confusion protected guilty people. By the time she reached the Bantry's cottage, Inspector Pike was already there. He rose sharply as she entered.
Well?
Miss Marple removed her gloves calmly. Mrs. Weatherby told me what happened. Mrs. Bantry gave a distressed little cry.
Oh, dear.
Pike stepped forward. She confessed? She admitted struggling with Mrs. Colwyn in the orchard, and causing the fall? The inspector exhaled slowly. But Miss Marple looked at him quietly. But she did not strangle Beatrice Colwyn. Silence followed. Pike frowned. How can you possibly know? Because Diana Weatherby is incapable of improving reality after tragedy. The inspector blinked. I beg your pardon? My dear inspector, said Miss Marple gently, there are two kinds of people after accidental death, those who collapse emotionally and those who begin arranging practical details. Mrs. Bantry shivered faintly. And Diana? Collapses. Pike remained unconvinced. She could still be lying. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, but not successfully. The inspector sat down heavily. Then who tied the scarf? Miss Marple moved toward the fire. Someone who needed the death to appear deliberate. Possibly. Mrs. Bantry said suddenly. But how would he know she was there? Miss Marple stopped. An excellent question. Indeed, perhaps the essential question. How had the second person arrived so quickly? Not coincidence, surely. Number. Someone already nearby. Someone expecting trouble, perhaps. And then, with quiet suddenness, another memory returned. Sally Brent's words. Mrs. Colwyn said she finally had proof. If Beatrice Colwyn possessed proof against Cedric Vale, whom would she contact? Not the police immediately, perhaps. Number. Someone emotionally connected. Someone frightened enough to react. Diana Weatherby. And if Vale discovered the meeting? Miss Marple looked up sharply. Inspector, when exactly was Cedric Vale seen at the Crown Hotel? Pike frowned. Several witnesses place him there around 3:30. Around? How precise were they? The inspector hesitated. Not very. Mrs. Bantry stared. You think he slipped away? I think, said Miss Marple quietly, that people in hotel lounges rarely observe one another carefully during tea. Pike rose abruptly. You believe Vale followed Mrs. Colwyn to the orchard, and found Diana gone and Mrs. Colwyn injured. Quite possibly still alive. Gone and Mrs. Colwyn injured. Quite possibly still alive. The inspector swore softly under his breath. Mrs. Bantry looked horrified. You mean he finished it? Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because another detail still troubled her deeply. Not merely the scarf, but the body itself. Something about the scene. Something artificial. Then suddenly she remembered. The position of the hands. Too orderly. Much too orderly for violent strangulation. Miss Marple became very still. My dear inspector, she said softly, did Dr. Haydock determine whether Mrs. Colwyn died from strangulation alone? Pike stared.
What?
The head injury, Miss Marple continued quietly. Could it itself have been fatal? The inspector looked startled. He said it was severe enough possibly to cause unconsciousness, perhaps death eventually. Mrs. Bantry gasped. You mean she might already have been dying when Vale found her? The room fell silent. Then Pike said slowly, But if Vale believes she was already dead, he may have staged the scene merely to protect himself, Miss Marple finished softly, and unintentionally completed the murder. No one spoke for several moments. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. At last Inspector Pike said, My God. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. It becomes rather ugly, doesn't it? Cedric Vale was arrested that evening, not for murder initially, but for obstruction, evidence tampering, and his involvement in the antique fraud investigation. Yet when confronted with Diana Weatherby's statement, his composure finally began to fracture. Inspector Pike later described the interview to Miss Marple in considerable detail. At first he denied everything, Pike said. Then he admitted going to the orchard. Miss Marple nodded. What exactly did he say? The inspector consulted notes. He claimed he followed Mrs. Colwyn because she threatened to expose him. Reasonable enough. He says he arrived after Diana Weatherby fled, and found Mrs. Colwyn unconscious. Yes. Pike's expression hardened. He insists he believes she was already dead. Miss Marple sighed softly. Did he? He says panic overcame him. Mrs. Bantry gave an indignant snort. That man has never panicked in his life. On the contrary, said Miss Marple quietly. Men like Cedric Vale panic very badly indeed when cornered. Pike continued. He admits arranging the scarf to suggest deliberate murder, and leaving suspicion to fall naturally upon Lawrence Red. Mrs. Bantry looked appalled. But that's monstrous. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, merely selfish. Inspector Pike frowned. He still denies strangling her alive. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. That, she reflected, might even be true, because panic could produce dreadful uncertainty afterward. A woman unconscious from head injury, a scarf tightened, a hurried escape. Who could say precisely when death occurred? And perhaps in a grim way it no longer mattered. Legally, yes. Morally, perhaps not. For Beatrice Colwyn would have died because several frightened people chose concealment over honesty, which was usually how tragedies happened in villages, not through evil alone, but through weakness. Late that night Miss Marple sat alone beside the dying fire. Rose Hill lay silent beyond the dark windows. The mystery had nearly resolved itself now, yet one sadness lingered particularly in her mind. Beatrice Colwyn herself, a woman who had spent years pursuing truth for a dead husband, a lonely woman perhaps, and fatally unaware that truth frightened ordinary people more than lies ever did. There came a quiet knock at the door. Mrs. Bantry entered in dressing-gown and slippers. Well, she sighed, it's nearly over. Mrs. Bantry sat down opposite her. Do you pity Diana Weatherby? Miss Marple considered carefully. And Vale? Miss Marple's needles moved slowly. No. Because he killed her? No, said Miss Marple softly, because he understood exactly what he was doing afterward. Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. Outside the rain finally began to ease, and in the quiet of the fading firelight, Miss Marple thought not for the first time that human beings were rarely destroyed by wickedness alone. Far more often they were destroyed by fear. The storm passed during the night. By morning Rose Hill appeared unnaturally bright, washed clean beneath sharp May sunlight. Birds sang extravagantly from hedges. Windows stood open. Children resumed ordinary games upon the green with the alarming speed unique to childhood. Only the adults remained subdued. Murder, Miss Marple reflected, lingered longest among those old enough to understand consequence. The village now possessed the exhausted air that followed scandal once excitement gave way to discomfort. Cedric Vale's arrest had satisfied curiosity but not peace of mind, because Rose Hill understood, though few would have admitted it aloud, that the affair reached far beyond one man. There had been lies, cowardice, old corruption, and respectable people entangled in all of it. At breakfast Mrs. Bantry announced, Mrs. Finch says the village shall never recover. My dear, said Miss Marple mildly, villages recover from everything except bad drainage. Mrs. Bantry smiled faintly, then grew thoughtful. Do you believe Vale will hang? Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. That depends upon what the doctors conclude. About Mrs. Colwyn? Mrs. Bantry hesitated. You still aren't certain whether she died from the fall or the strangling? No. And does it matter? Miss Marple looked out toward the garden. Morally, legally, emotionally, the answers differed. Yes, she said softly. And no. Inspector Pike arrived shortly before noon, carrying official fatigue and unexpected humility. I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. My dear Inspector, policemen frequently do. To his credit, Pike laughed. We've released Lawrence Red. Mrs. Bantry looked delighted. And Sally Brent? Ecstatic, said Pike dryly. Miss Marple nodded quietly. One innocent life restored at least. A small mercy. The inspector sat down. There's been another development. Yes? We searched Vale's London office thoroughly this morning. We found records connecting his father directly to the Ashcombe thefts. Miss Marple folded her hands. So Adrian Colwyn was innocent. The inspector looked thoughtful. Mrs. Colwyn was telling the truth all along. Indeed. Pike sighed heavily. She spent years trying to clear her husband's name. Mrs. Bantry looked genuinely distressed, and then died just when she finally succeeded. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. That is rather cruel. Silence settled briefly over the room. Then Pike said, There's one thing I still don't entirely understand. Miss Marple waited. Why didn't Miss Colwyn simply go directly to the police once she discovered the truth? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, because human beings almost never proceed directly towards sensible outcomes. But why delay? She was gathering proof, and perhaps— Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. Perhaps she wished certain people to suffer first. Pike frowned. You think she enjoyed frightening them? A little. Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. But she was the wronged party. Yes, said Miss Marple gently. And wronged people are not always improved by suffering. That, she thought privately, was one of the saddest truths about injustice. Later that afternoon Miss Marple paid a quiet call upon Diana Weatherby. Willow House seemed changed already. The drawn curtains were open. Fresh flowers stood in the hall. The oppressive atmosphere of dread had eased slightly. Diana herself, however, looked fragile. Not frightened now, merely exhausted. Inspector Pike told me everything, she said quietly after Miss Marple sat down. He says I may not be charged. Miss Marple nodded. The fall appears accidental. Diana closed her eyes briefly. But she died because of me. No, said Miss Marple softly. She died because too many people concealed truth for too many years. Tears rose suddenly in Diana's eyes. My husband knew Adrian Colwyn was innocent, and I said nothing. Miss Marple regarded her gently. My dear, most tragedies continue because ordinary people persuade themselves silence is kindness. Diana gave a broken little laugh. It never is it? No. For several moments the younger woman sat staring at her clasped hands. Then she said quietly, Beatrice hated me at the end. Miss Marple thought carefully before answering. No, she said at last. I think she pitied you. Diana looked startled. She didn't seem pitying. Proud people rarely do. The tears slipped silently down Diana's face now. She told me once that truth mattered more than comfort. Miss Marple nodded. That sounds like her. Diana looked toward the window. I spent years protecting my son from disgrace. And in doing so, said Miss Marple softly, you taught yourself to live in fear. The younger woman bowed her head. Miss Marple rose quietly to leave. At the door Diana stopped her. There's one thing I never told the police. Miss Marple turned. What is that? Diana hesitated. After the fall, before I ran. Yes? Beatrice opened her eyes once. Miss Marple became very still. She spoke? What did she say? Diana's voice trembled. She said, Don't let him bury it again. Silence filled the room. Then Miss Marple nodded slowly. Of course, even dying, Beatrice Colwyn had thought not of revenge but of truth. That evening Miss Marple walked alone through the village. The sunset lay pale gold across Rose Hill's rooftops. Smoke drifted lazily upward from chimneys. Somewhere a piano played uncertain scales. Ordinary life returning. It always did. Near the churchyard she encountered Lawrence Reed and Sally Brent together. The young man looked thinner, older somehow, but peaceful. He stopped awkwardly. Miss Marple. My dear boy. Lawrence hesitated. I owe you thanks. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You owe them to Sally. She possessed more courage than you. Sally blushed scarlet while Lawrence laughed weakly. Yes, he admitted. Miss Marple regarded them kindly. Are you still planning to run away together? The two young people exchanged startled glances. Then Sally burst suddenly into laughter. I don't think so. Lawrence looked embarrassed. We've decided perhaps it was all rather foolish. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, nearly all romance is foolish. That is what makes it so charming. They walked on together down the lane afterward, young and uncertain and alive. Miss Marple watched them thoughtfully. Then she continued alone toward the church. The orchard beyond the vicarage stood quiet now beneath evening light. Apple blossoms drifted softly through the grass where Beatrice Colwyn had fallen. Miss Marple paused there for a long moment. Such a small thing to begin at all, she thought. A silver thimble, an object no larger than a walnut. And inside it, hidden for decades, enough truth to ruin lives. Human beings concealed things so strangely. Not only documents or crimes, but shame. weakness, all tucked away carefully inside ordinary lives like secrets hidden in silver. The bells began ringing softly for evening service. Miss Marple turned at last and walked slowly back toward the village. Behind her the orchard remained silent beneath the fading light, and somewhere deep within Rosehill old ghosts had finally begun to rest. A week later Rosehill had begun the delicate process by which English villages repaired themselves after catastrophe. People resumed discussing weather with determined enthusiasm. Garden walls were repainted. The vicar preached heavily about forgiveness to a congregation far more interested in specifics. Even Mrs. Finch had recovered sufficiently to resume criticizing floral arrangements at church. Outwardly, normality returned, but Miss Marple knew villages never entirely forgot. Scandal sank into the soil like rainwater, invisible afterward perhaps, yet always present beneath the surface. On a warm afternoon near the end of May, Miss Marple sat beneath the Bantry's garden parasol shelling peas, while Bantry read aloud from a magazine article about vitamins with mounting disbelief. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, "apparently butter is now either deadly or essential. One can hardly keep up." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Medical certainty changes rather often. Human nature much less so." Miss Bantry lowered the magazine. "You've been thinking about the case again. You still believe something remains unfinished." Miss Marple dropped another pea gently into the bowl. "One loose thread." Mrs. Bantry sighed dramatically. "There is always a loose thread with you." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "and if ignored they usually unravel cardigans." Before Mrs. Bantry could reply, the maid appeared carrying a visiting card. "Colonel Harbury to see you, miss." Mrs. Bantry raised both eyebrows immediately.
"Well?"
Colonel Hugh Harbury entered a moment later. He looked older than he had only 10 days earlier. Not ill exactly, merely diminished. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, often aged people abruptly. "Miss Marple." "Colonel." He remained standing awkwardly beside the garden chair. "I wish to thank you."
That is unnecessary.
"No," he said quietly. "I think it is." Mrs. Bantry tactfully announced an urgent need to supervise jam. The colonel waited until she disappeared before speaking again. "The police recovered additional documents from Vale's office."
"Yes?"
"They confirm my involvement in the Ashcombe purchases." Miss Marple nodded silently. "I shall likely face charges." "Perhaps." The colonel gave a bitter smile. "At my age, disgrace seems rather ridiculous." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Only painful." He looked at her sharply. "You pity me?" "My dear Colonel, I pity nearly everyone eventually." For the first time he laughed genuinely. Then his expression grew serious again. "There's something else." Miss Marple waited. "The day Beatrice Colwyn died, she visited me shortly before the fete." Miss Marple became still. "That was not in your earlier statement?" "No." "Why not?" Harbury stared toward the garden. "Cowardice, I suppose." An honest answer at last. "What happened?" "She told me she intended to expose everything publicly. She said Vale had continued his father's operations for years. Forged provenance, illegal sales abroad." Miss Marple nodded. The colonel hesitated. "She also said someone in Rosehill had helped him recently." Miss Marple's fingers stopped moving among the peas. "Recently?" Now that was interesting. Very interesting indeed. "Did she name anyone?" "No." "But you suspected someone?" Harbury looked uncomfortable. "Yes." The colonel lowered his voice. "My wife." Silence settled beneath the garden parasol. Miss Marple studied him quietly. "Why?" "Edith handled many of the manor finances during the war years. Vale occasionally advised on sales." Harbury rubbed one hand tiredly across his forehead. "I wondered if she'd become entangled somehow. Did you ask her?" "No." "Why not?" He gave a harsh little laugh. "Because after 30 years of marriage one learns there are questions one prefers not to ask." Miss Marple sighed inwardly. Again fear. Always fear. But something troubled her immediately. Mrs. Harbury? Number. Edith Harbury was vain, dramatic, and foolish, but not secretive enough. No, the loose thread lay elsewhere. Did Beatrice Colwyn seem frightened during this conversation? asked Miss Marple. The colonel thought carefully.
"No."
Miss Marple looked up sharply. Not frightened. That mattered, because according to everyone else, Beatrice had been increasingly afraid during her final days. Yet shortly before death, confronting Colonel Harbury, she appeared confident. Unless she believed she finally possessed complete proof. Miss Marple rose suddenly. The movement startled the colonel. Miss Marple? My dear Colonel, she said softly, when exactly did Mrs. Colwyn say she obtained this final evidence? He frowned. She implied quite recently. How recently? The previous evening, I think. Miss Marple stood very still. The previous evening. Not the old Ashcombe records then. Something new. Something discovered only hours before death. And suddenly the final loose thread pulled sharply tight. That evening Miss Marple asked Inspector Pike to join a small gathering at the Bantrys' cottage. Also invited were Colonel and Mrs. Harbury, Diana Weatherby, Lawrence Red, Sally Brent, Dr. Haydock, and Cedric Vale, brought under police supervision from Much Benham. Mrs. Bantry later described the atmosphere as rather like a tea party arranged by Satan. Vale entered, smiling faintly, though his eyes remained cold. "My dear Miss Marple," he drawled, "how theatrical." "No more than murder," she replied gently. Everyone settled uneasily. Outside, twilight deepened across the garden. Inspector Pike stood near the fireplace watching Miss Marple carefully. "You believe the case incomplete," he said. Vale laughed softly. "Surely not. You already have your villain." Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "My dear Mr. Vale, villains are rarely so tidy." Silence followed. Then Miss Marple folded her hands. Beatrice Colwyn came to Rosehill seeking truth about her husband's disgrace. Eventually she uncovered the Ashcombe affair and Mr. Vale's connection to illegal antique dealings. Vale said coolly. "Allegedly." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though unfortunately the documents are rather persuasive." She continued calmly. "Mrs. Colwyn frightened several people. Colonel Harbury feared exposure. Mrs. Weatherby feared disgrace for her family. Lawrence Red feared scandal. No one spoke. But none of those fears fully explain what happened in the orchard. Vale shifted slightly. Miss Marple noticed. "Mrs. Colwyn died because she discovered something newer than Ashcombe, something immediate." She turned suddenly towards Cedric Vale. "She discovered you were still conducting illegal sales through Rosehill Manor." The smile vanished from his face. Mrs. Harbury gasped. Inspector Pike straightened sharply. Miss Marple continued softly. "The old crimes mattered emotionally to Mrs. Colwyn, but the new ones mattered legally." Vale said coldly, "You have no proof." "On the contrary." Miss Marple reached calmly toward the small table beside her chair. Upon it rested an ordinary object, a silver-backed clothes-brush. She lifted it gently. Mrs. Colwyn understood concealment very well by the end. After discovering records hidden inside the thimble, she began searching elsewhere. She turned the brush over carefully. And last night Inspector Pike discovered this. With a small twist, the back panel loosened. Inside lay folded papers, detailed records, recent dates, payments. Cedric Vale had gone completely pale. Inspector Pike crossed the room swiftly and took the documents. "My God!" Miss Marple looked quietly at Vale. "You searched Ivy Cottage repeatedly because you knew Mrs. Colwyn had hidden evidence somewhere. But you never found the second hiding-place." Vale said nothing. His composure had finally broken entirely. Mrs. Harbury stared at the papers in horror. But Colonel Harbury interrupted heavily. "Not me." Everyone turned. The colonel looked exhausted. "I suspected Edith handled some transactions, foolishly perhaps, carelessly, but not knowingly." Mrs. Harbury burst suddenly into tears. "I thought they were legitimate sales." Vale closed his eyes briefly. "Finish now." Miss Marple said gently, "Mrs. Colwyn intended to bring these documents to the police after the ferret. That is why she appeared confident shortly before her death." Inspector Pike looked sharply toward Vale. "And you discovered she had them." Vale said nothing, but silence itself became answer enough. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "You followed her to the orchard intending to recover the papers. Instead you found her already injured after the struggle with Diana Weatherby. And then," said Pike grimly, "he staged the murder." Vale laughed suddenly, a terrible sound. "You sanctimonious old fools," he said quietly. "Every one of you bought things from me. Paintings. You all preferred not asking questions." No one answered, because he was not entirely wrong. At last Miss Marple said softly, "That is usually how corruption survives." For several moments after Cedric Vale's outburst no one moved. The room seemed suspended in a peculiar stillness, broken only by the soft ticking of the Bantry's mantel clock. Vale stood near the window, pale now beneath the lamplight, all easy charm gone at last. Without it he appeared unexpectedly ordinary. That, Miss Marple reflected, was often the final disappointment of wicked people. Inspector Pike folded the recovered documents carefully. "I think," he said quietly, "we are finished here. Vale gave a faint smile. "Oh no, Inspector. I rather think you're only beginning." But the arrogance had weakened. Fear showed through now. Real fear. 2 constables waiting outside entered a moment later and escorted him from the room without struggle. The front door closed. Silence remained behind. Mrs. Harbury began crying softly into a lace handkerchief. Colonel Harbury stared fixedly at the carpet. Weatherby sat rigid and pale beside the fire. It was Lawrence Red who finally spoke. "So that was it," he said quietly. "All of it." Miss Marple nodded gently. Dr. Haydock exhaled heavily. "Extraordinary—" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Only human." Inspector Pike looked toward her. "You'd better explain the whole thing properly," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "Yes, please, Jane. Preferably from the beginning before my nerves collapse entirely." Miss Marple settled more comfortably into her chair. She folded her hands atop her knitting, and because she belonged to a generation that valued clarity over drama, she began simply. "Beatrice Colwyn came to Rosehill with a purpose," said Miss Marple. "Not revenge exactly, though she undoubtedly carried bitterness for many years." Diana Weatherby lowered her eyes. Her husband Adrian had been blamed for crimes connected to the Ashcombe collection after the war. In reality, those crimes involved illegal antique dealings conducted partly through Cedric Vale's father. Colonel Harbury spoke hoarsely. "And me." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Though more through weakness than criminal intent, I think." The colonel nodded miserably. Miss Marple continued. "Mrs. Colwyn gradually uncovered the truth about Ashcombe. She also discovered that Cedric Vale had inherited not only his father's business but his methods," Inspector Pike said grimly. "Forgery, smuggling, fraudulent provenance." Mrs. Harbury whispered faintly. "And I helped him." "You trusted him," Miss Marple corrected softly. "There is a difference." Edith Harbury burst again into tears. Miss Marple went on. "Initially everyone assumed Mrs. Colwyn was blackmailing people for money. That was only partly true. She frightened people because she possessed knowledge, and because frightened people often imagine the worst." Diana Weatherby spoke suddenly. "She hated us." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "No," she said. "I don't believe she did." Diana stared. "She wanted acknowledgment. Justice for her husband." Miss Marple paused. "Unfortunately, years of loneliness had also made her somewhat hard. No one disputed that. She pressured people emotionally," Miss Marple continued, "particularly Mrs. Weatherby." Diana closed her eyes briefly. "She said my son deserved truth." "And she was right," Diana whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Right and kindness, she reflected, were not always identical things. "At the fete," she continued softly, Mrs. Colwyn arranged to meet Diana Weatherby near the orchard. She intended finally to force a confession regarding the old scandal. Diana's hands trembled slightly. "We argued." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Mrs. Colwyn confronted her strongly. Mrs. Weatherby panicked. They struggled. And on the wet grass beneath the orchard trees, Mrs. Colwyn fell and struck her head. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "That injury alone may ultimately have proved fatal." Inspector Pike looked grim. But Diana fled. Diana whispered, "I thought she was dead." "Quite naturally," Miss Marple said gently. "Most people would." The room fell silent again. Then Lawrence Red asked quietly, "How did Vale know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because he had already been watching Mrs. Colwyn." Inspector Pike nodded. "He admitted following her. Mrs. Colwyn had discovered his recent illegal dealings and hidden the evidence. Vale believed she carried documents exposing him completely." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "So he arrived at the orchard, and found Mrs. Colwyn unconscious," Miss Marple finished softly. Dr. Haydock frowned. "Still alive, perhaps." "Possibly." Miss Marple's expression grew sad. And there Mr. Vale faced a choice. No one spoke. "He could summon help," she continued quietly, "or he could protect himself." Inspector Pike said coldly, "He chose protection." Miss Marple folded her hands more tightly. "He arranged the scarf to create the appearance of deliberate murder. In doing so, he either killed Mrs. Colwyn outright or ensured her death." Diana covered her face briefly.
"Oh, God."
"But why frame Lawrence Reed?" asked Sally suddenly. Miss Marple turned toward her kindly. "Because Mr. Vale understood human weakness extremely well. He knew villagers notice romantic scandal immediately." Lawrence flushed slightly. Miss Marple continued. "He had already observed that Mrs. Colwyn possessed influence over Lawrence Red. Their quarrel provided a convenient direction for suspicion. Inspector Pike gave a rueful sigh, and I walked directly into it. My dear gave a rueful sigh, and I walked directly into it. My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple gently, murderers depend enormously upon policemen behaving logically. Mrs. Bantry laughed helplessly despite the grimness of the evening. Pike looked offended, then reluctantly amused. For a little while no one spoke. The room seemed exhausted by truth. At last Colonel Harbury said quietly, "All those years—" Miss Marple looked at him. "I told myself Ashcombe no longer mattered, but it did." He nodded slowly. "Because people remember?" "No," said Miss Marple softly, "because guilt remembers." Silence followed that, the kind of silence impossible to improve. Finally Diana. Weatherby rose slowly. "I should have spoken years ago." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Yes," she said, "you should." Diana looked almost relieved by the honesty. "I was afraid." "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "most terrible things begin with fear." Outside night had fully settled over Rosehill. The windows reflected the room now. Tired faces, lowered eyes, aging people confronting old truths at last. Inspector Pike stood. "I'll arrange formal statements tomorrow." No one objected. One by one they departed quietly afterward. The Harburys first, then Diana Weatherby, then Lawrence and Sally together. At last only Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry remained beside the dying fire. Mrs. Bantry let out a long breath. "Well, yes," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry shook her head slowly. "All because of a little silver thimble." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, my dear." She picked up her knitting once more. The thimble merely held the secret. The tragedy was already there long before anyone opened it. June arrived gently in Rosehill. The hedges thickened into deep green walls alive with birdsong. Roses climbed over cottage fences. Children chased one another across the village green, as though murder and scandal belonged to some distant season already fading into memory. But memory in villages was peculiar. Events passed yet never entirely disappeared. They settled instead into conversation, into glances, into the subtle rearrangement of opinion that altered how people regarded one another forever afterward. Miss Marple observed these things quietly during her final days in Rosehill. The village was healing, though not evenly. Colonel Harbury had withdrawn almost entirely from society. Mrs. Harbury attended church twice as frequently as before and spoke constantly of charitable work with the determined energy of someone trying to outpace humiliation. Diana Weatherby, however, changed most visibly. Fear had left her. Not happiness, Miss Marple thought. Perhaps some losses could never entirely be repaired, but relief. Truth, even painful truth, lightened people eventually. One warm afternoon Miss Marple encountered her near the church gate. Diana wore pale blue and carried flowers for the altar. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said quietly. They walked slowly together beneath the chestnut trees. "I wanted to thank you," Diana said after a moment. "My dear, I'm not certain you should." Diana smiled faintly. "No, perhaps not." She hesitated. "But you made me stop hiding." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "That is often uncomfortable." "Yes," Diana admitted. "But strange as it sounds, I feel freer than I have in years." They paused near the churchyard path. "The police told me Cedric Vale confessed fully," Diana added. Miss Marple nodded. "He understood the evidence against him was overwhelming." "And Mrs. Colwyn?" Miss Marple was silent briefly. "She achieved what she wanted in the end." Diana looked down at the flowers in her hands. "I wish she had lived to see it." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "So do I." They parted there quietly. Miss Marple watched Diana disappear beneath the trees and thought not for the first time that courage arrived late in many lives, but still mattered greatly when it came. That evening the Bantrys insisted upon a farewell supper. Mrs. Bantry declared firmly that no guest of hers would escape Rosehill without proper feeding, regardless of murder, disgrace, or emotional collapse. Dr. Haydock attended. So did Lawrence Reed and Sally Brent, both looking considerably happier than during their previous appearances. "Not running away after all?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Lawrence laughed. "No." Sally smiled. "We decided ordinary life might be simpler." "My dear," said Mrs. Bantry, "ordinary life is always preferable." Particularly after police investigations, the evening proved unexpectedly cheerful. People laughed more easily now. Even painful subjects lost some sharpness beneath candlelight and good food. After supper Lawrence approached Miss Marple privately near the drawing-room window. "I never thanked you properly. There is no need." "There is." He hesitated awkwardly. "I behaved rather badly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You behaved like a young man frightened of scandal. England is full of them." He laughed despite himself. "I suppose it is." Then his expression grew serious. "Do you think Mrs. Colwyn was happy at the end?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "No," she said at last, "but I think she was satisfied." Lawrence nodded slowly. "That seems rather sad." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It is." The following morning dawned bright and windless. Miss Marple's suitcase stood ready in the Bantrys' hall while the motor-car waited outside to take her toward the station. "Mrs." Bantry fluttered anxiously over sandwiches no one required. "You'll come back soon?" "Perhaps." "You always say perhaps." "My dear, certainty is very dangerous." "Mrs." Bantry kissed her affectionately. "Rose Hill will feel terribly dull after this." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Give it time. Villages are remarkably inventive." As the car rode slowly through Rose Hill's lanes, Miss Marple looked out at the familiar cottages and gardens. Mrs. Finch arranging roses. Florence. Hill speaking earnestly to the butcher. Children racing bicycles near the green. Ordinary life continuing. Yet beneath it all remained the faint invisible traces of what had happened. Beatrice Colwyn. Chidrigvale. A silver thimble concealing decades of guilt, and so many people frightened into silence. The car passed the orchard behind the vicarage. Apple blossoms still drifted softly through the grass. Miss Marple looked at the trees thoughtfully. Human beings, she reflected, were very curious creatures. They hid truths for years, believing concealment protected them. Yet truth nearly always emerged eventually through accident, conscience, love, fear, or sheer chance. And when it did, the damage rarely lay in the truth itself, but in the years of silence beforehand. At the station platform, Mrs. Bantry fussed once more over luggage while the train steamed gently beside them. "My dear Jane," she said suddenly, "there's one thing I still don't entirely understand." "Yes?" "Why did Beatrice Colwyn hide the final evidence inside that ridiculous clothes brush?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because people search obvious places first." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "No, I mean psychologically." Miss Marple considered. Then she said softly, "Perhaps because by the end she had learned something very sad."
"What was that?"
"That dangerous truths are safest hidden among ordinary things." The whistle sounded. Miss Marple boarded the train. As it pulled slowly away from the station, she looked back once toward the distant village beyond the trees. Rose Hill already appeared peaceful again. But Miss Marple knew better than most that beneath every peaceful village lay invisible histories, small jealousies, old griefs, forgotten loves, hidden guilt, and occasionally, tucked quietly inside something as harmless as a silver thimble, murder.